Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a new edition of True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Jackalone, and we have a very exciting guest today. We will be joined by Lisa Desire. Lisa Desire is a former forensic scientist who worked for the Chief Medical Examiner's Office in New York City. She holds a bachelor's from Cedar Crest College in genetic engineering. She has a master's of forensic science from John Jay College, and she is the author of Goodnight CSI. It's a children's book, and we're going to talk about that a little later on. And it introduces young children to forensic science. And with that, we will welcome Lisa Desire, who's having storms like everybody else. So if there's a
Absolutely.
little glitch in the system, just bear with us while this is going on. Lisa, thanks for coming on to the show today. I just did your introduction. A very impressive resume you have there.
Thank you for having me.
Oh no, this is great because investigative genetic genealogy is, of course, the rave, right? It's the latest thing. It's exciting, and we're seeing some big cases being solved. But like even myself, I am so unfamiliar with some of the terms and stuff like that, and we want to break that down today. But what's like the easiest definition of what investigative genetic genealogy is?
So, investigative genetic genealogy is essentially taking DNA from a crime scene or from unidentified human remains, uploading it to a public database in hopes of finding a relation to that person, whether it's a close or a distant relationship to that person.
Now, is this done? When part of the process? So the cops find a DNA sample and they put it into CODIS, right? And that's basically how it starts.
That's how it
And then
starts.
if they don't get a hit, this is like kind of what they do, or how does that process go?
That's right. So the whole process has to start and end with CODIS, and CODIS stands for Combined DNA Index System. It's our national database that's maintained by the FBI, and that was designed in hopes of making a direct connection or an exact match between, like we said, a crime scene sample and let's say a convicted offender or an arrestee. So the process starts with CODIS. You recover something from the crime scene, it goes to the lab, they generate a DNA profile. They check CODIS first. All right. So if there's no match in CODIS and permission has been granted, that sample will then go to a direct-to-consumer company, a public company like Ancestry, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and they'll do their own set of DNA testing with that. That test is going to give an indication as to whether or not somebody could have given their sample up to be a close relative, a cousin, a mother, a sibling of that sample. So it's a long process. Then the genealogist does their magic behind the scenes. They draw up some family trees to turn over to law enforcement and say, hey, we've narrowed it down. We think the source of this DNA could be related to one of these individuals. Then it's up to the detective to do some, or law enforcement to do their work, try to get a sample from that person. Then it goes back to the forensic lab who generated that CODIS profile in the first place. So it always starts and ends with CODIS.
Now, when you said about permission, who gives that permission? You talk about like the state, how they run certain things on this, because we know states have different rules on this. How does
The
that permission
state,
work?
not only that, you need permission from a judge to go ahead and do this. There's a lot of criteria that needs to be checked before it can just be sent off for genetic genealogy. You need to check with the crime lab first, check the quality of the sample, make sure if it is a mixture of DNA, it's not a complicated mixture, make sure it's not contaminated with anything. Make sure the laboratory has enough of that sample left to turn over. And of course, the case has to be one, as we said, started with CODIS. As long as there's not a direct match in CODIS, then you can go ahead and try IgG on it.
Gotcha. So, and we hear a lot of different things that get thrown around. What's the difference? Like, if someone says, like, they're doing an ancestry search or familial search, or the forensic genealogy or investigative genetic genealogy, are they all the same thing, or are they all different?
They're all different. So let's start with a traditional forensic search. Okay, and that is what you said, either generating a DNA profile from a crime scene sample, or maybe unidentified human remains, checking CODIS to see if there's a match, generating what's known as an STR, forensic profile, or a short tandem repeat DNA profile. That's what all forensic laboratories are doing. They're generating STR profiles, looking at the DNA that we inherit from our mom and our dad. So that's your traditional forensic search. A familial search, so let me go back and say that only law enforcement and forensic laboratories have access to this type of testing and to the CODIS database. So then a familial search is still working with the CODIS database, and it is similar to a genetic genealogy search in that you're looking for a very close relative to, let's say, this crime scene sample, but we're talking a parent or maybe a child or maybe a full sibling relationship would work best. Again, so familial is you're not going to find an exact match, but hopefully a close match, and it's all within the CODIS database. So now when you jump over to Ancestry or our genetic genealogy searches, anybody can do these. So it's just a matter of obtaining a kit, either spitting in a tube or swabbing the inside of your cheek, sending it off to a public database. You are voluntarily submitting your sample to this. All right, so it goes to these databases. They're going to find out things like who you may be related to, or who you are related to, I should say. Some companies will go as far as giving you an idea of what sort of diseases run in your family, what type of medical conditions you might be predisposed to, and building out your heritage. You know, what percentage of your family came from Italy? What percentage of your family came from Ireland? Things like that. It's also important to know that the information you get might not be something that you want to hear. But again, with these types of testing, you are voluntarily giving up your information, your genetic information. And so that's where the differences lie between a traditional forensic testing and familial. That's CODIS and law enforcement. And then Ancestry, genetic genealogy, that's public database.
And what makes it the investigative part of the forensic is that it gets applied with the law and everything else that goes along with it. Is that how that all comes about?
Exactly. So it's now taking these unidentified human remains or these crime scene samples and sort of marrying it with the technology that they're using to generate a different set of DNA, a different DNA profile to help kind of tie the two together.
Right. Now, I have never submitted my DNA to any of these labs to find out where they're from. I just tell people I'm from Brooklyn. What does that mean that nobody can ever find me?
No, actually, it's the opposite. So
really,
it is the opposite. It's actually believed that right now, based on the number of people in America that have submitted their sample, more than 60% of us can be found just because a relative of ours has given their DNA. So what'll happen is a sample, and it's a little upsetting, right? I mean, like, I've never given my DNA to one of these companies, but my immediate family has. So my parents have, my brother has. So when it comes time for that genealogist to build out a family tree using their DNA, I will be placed in that family tree. So yes, you can be found whether you're trying to hide or not. Yeah, more than 60%. And it's thought that as the years go on and more people submit their samples, they're saying that close to 90% of us will be able to be found in one way or another because we'll show up in somebody's family tree.
Well, that's pretty interesting, right? So then I guess then it doesn't matter if you submit it or not eventually, because if you're saying 90%, so we have what, 325 million people in the country. So right now 60% of them can be identified through this. That's pretty wild.
Exactly, because when they find these connections through genetic genealogy, they can find out to third, fourth, fifth, sixth cousins. It doesn't have to be a very close relative of yours, but eventually they may find their way back to you, so to speak.
So yeah, so you're saying like sixth to seventh removed or whatever they call that? Is that basically how it goes?
Yes.
So wow, so it doesn't even have to be your brother or your sister. It can be people you never even met.
Right. That's correct.
Or you even know existed.
Which I think initially is what people were initially using this for, to build out their family trees. You know, you think about it, before genetic genealogy, people would go through yearbooks, look at vital records, right? Marriage certificates, birth certificates, death certificates, looking through newspapers, looking through military records, trying to build out their family trees. And in addition to that, just listening to stories that our relatives have shared with us about the ways of life and how, we spent our early days generations ago. So those are all the things that we collectively used to build out these trees. So now they're working with your DNA. So they're able to trace back generations and generations. It's pretty
That's
amazing.
wild. That is wild. I mean, when you think about this, so basically, so you had mentioned unidentified human remains, and I guess cold cases, whether it's homicide, old assaults, that kind of stuff. I mean, this is prime for this kind of technology.
Exactly. And not every case is one that will turn to IGG. So when you were asking about, getting permission, and I said, well, you need to start with CODIS and make sure you're not finding anything in CODIS, and you need to check your DNA sample and, get permission from a judge. The other thing is that this is usually reserved for situations where it's a violent crime. So it's a homicide, there's a sexual assault, something involving children, human trafficking. So a typical burglary case probably is not going to get IGG attention.
Here's an interesting little tidbit. Matt
Initial
McMahon,
IGG hit for the Rachel Warren case.
with third cousin, yeah, in the Rachel Morin
Yeah.
case, yeah, he and Rachel had a daughter together,
Yep.
and so that's interesting. Third cousin. So, like I said, you might not even know these people, like when you're dealing with this kind of stuff. But from an investigative standpoint, for me, it's kind of exciting. I wish this was available really back when we were doing cold cases. We had lots of DNA no hits in the system, and now, but I mean, this is a long-term thing. This isn't something that you just put it into the computer and say, okay, here, build my tree and let's do it.
Exactly. If you talk to some of these genetic genealogists, they'll tell you that it could take weeks, months, years to find the people that they're looking for. And it really depends on who's submitting their sample, whose DNA is actually in those databases, because it does have to make its way back to you at some point. So if no one in your family, as far back and as widespread as you can find, if none of them submitted their DNA, then you're probably okay. But the chances are somewhere along the line, someone has submitted their sample. But most of the times, like you said, you'll put something in CODIS and it just sits there and there's not a hit. So when they're building their family trees, it could actually, as I said, it could take quite a long time for them to get what they're looking for.
And the fact that, if you get convicted of a felony in most states, or sometimes even upon arrest, they take DNA now. So that's basically, you get all this new DNA in there without even having anybody voluntarily doing it, because that goes into the CODIS system, but from the law enforcement database, not from the ancestry database, correct?
Exactly. Yep. They're two different databases. Yep. Public has no access to a CODIS database. That's law enforcement and forensic labs.
And Missy had a comment here about one of the companies got sold recently, or is in Chapter 11.
It was 23andMe. They are closing their doors. They had a big data breach a few years ago. So I think I saw a question come up that says, who gets their DNA, or who gets the DNA samples? That's a good question. They're not sure yet. If this is sort of a word of caution, if you are someone who's listening to this and you've submitted your sample to 23andMe, you want to reach out to them and find out how you can get your data. You absolutely want to download your raw data and keep it to yourself, and find out if they can remove your sample from their database in hopes that they haven't sold it to another company. That's the scary thing. Even though there are contracts and there are agreements, privacy agreements that you'll sign when you send your sample in, really, once that sample leaves your mouth, if it's a saliva sample, an oral swab, or your hands, it's really out of your control.
Right. So, I mean, there's a couple of big cases that have, of course, we had the Golden State Killer, right? I guess that was the first one that put IGG on the map, right, so to speak.
Exactly. Yes.
And then we're seeing some other cases, particular Brian Kohlberger, correct, with the IGG. We're not going to get into that whole thing there, but there seems to be some potential issues raised by the defense in this.
There's a lot of controversy. As we said earlier, oftentimes IgG is reserved for cold cases. They've checked CODIS and they didn't find a match. It can also be used in a case where they think public safety is a concern. So here you have 4 students, 4 college students who are killed. So initial thought is, it could be a public safety concern. So IgG was brought on board. When you submit your sample to these companies, you have the option to opt in or opt out of helping law enforcement. So if you opt out, the idea is that if law enforcement wants to access that particular company, they won't have access to your DNA sample. One of the things that I'm hearing in the Brian Kohberger case is that law enforcement may have jumped through some hoops or skirted a few issues in order to be able to trace the DNA sample back to Brian's parents. When the time comes for IgG to be used and law enforcement is going to basically take that extracted DNA, whether it's from a crime scene sample or unidentified human remains, they bring it to one of these companies. They need to identify themselves as law enforcement and say that this is what they're doing. They're trying to solve a cold case. They're trying to identify an unidentified person. And if law enforcement doesn't do that, then they're violating the rules. So there is talk. I'm not working on the case, but there is talk that with the Brian Kohberger case, law enforcement either did not identify themselves as law enforcement, or when it came time for the genetic genealogist to build out those trees, that they were accessing information that should not have been accessed. Gotcha. So there's a lot of talk back and forth. I don't know the real story, but those are some of the things that are of concern in this particular case.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, we only know too what the defense raises because the prosecutor's not allowed to talk about any of these things. But the defense, but they might have an argument with that. So we're going to find out. I always said in law enforcement we get a new tool and we break it pretty quickly. We play with it so much. I mean, you have. I guess we're dealing with Fourth Amendment issues, right? With search and seizure is the big thing, and I mean, correct. I guess. Yeah, I don't know what Idaho calls it, but we call it here the map hearing, right? The Ohio map versus Ohio about how police get things with or without a search warrant. So it's that's going to be interesting to see. Have they done that yet in this case? Do you know?
I'm really not sure. I know they were concerned because I believe the sample that was obtained to make that confirmation to Brian's DNA was taken from his parents' trash. Whether or not that trash can was close to his parents' house or next to the garage as opposed to along the curb and ready to be taken for trash. I know that's definitely plays a different role in different states as to what is now fair game. What expectation to privacy do you still have?
Right. Yeah, you're talking about the California versus Greenwood, abandoned property, but it has to be at the curb line. This is where it can't be on the side of the house. So if it happened at the curb line, it's good. Actually, in my research on that, the only state that it still would require a warrant even after they take it is New Jersey. Everyone else is pretty much it's abandoned property. As soon as you put it in your garbage, you put it on the curb, it's free for anybody to take. So,
and I think for some places you can follow that trash truck to the dump, and then you can go ahead and start sifting through.
Yeah, there's different nuances for it, but most of it deals without a warrant. So that's the interesting part of the whole thing.
If you think about it, anything that we discard, like if you're walking down the street and you're not that you're going to litter, but if you drop a bottle of water or a straw, or you spit on the ground, or something like that, it's fair game. It's there for someone to pick up.
Discarded pizza crust.
Discarded pizza crust. Yep. Napkins that we're wiping our mouths on in the restaurant. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. The Flynn Brown brings up a great case because I believe they do have DNA in that case, right? The John Benet Ramsey case. Have you heard anything on that one in respect? Have they tried to do IgG, or that's this is just if you heard? I mean, we know you're not working on these cases, but sometimes
so it
people
is one
hear
of those
whispers.
Things that we sit here and think, well, this case has been unsolved for how many years? Supposedly there was foreign male DNA found in this case, so why wouldn't they go ahead and do this? I've heard that her father was pushing for it to be done. but I don't know if they're actually doing it. It depends on how much DNA, like we said, how much DNA they have, what condition is in, can they even find that DNA sample? What's their chain of custody look like? So it would be smart for them to go ahead and do this if they're able to. If they are able to, I would imagine they would do it, but who knows?
Marnie gives us a good, always eat your crust. Yeah. I think there's been a couple of cases, right? I think Samuel Little, I think they caught him with a pizza crust too out in California.
I
So
think so.
yeah,
Pizza
I
crust,
think so.
anything you leave behind is fair game.
Right. So, and for those that might not have understood my vague reference there, but we talk about Rex Uriman in the Long Island serial killer case about the pizza crust, and then they also identified the daughter through a soda can or a Monster can or something that she discarded on the platform because they had DNA from other individuals found at these crime scenes, and
Yes.
yeah, so that's actually an interesting thing, but that's actually not what's being questioned in this case. This question is like I guess the actual use of this in court in New York State. That's basically what we're dealing with on that.
So I think for that particular case, when DNA testing was done, I know there were also hairs that were found on the victims. So the type of DNA testing that was done is a little different than the STR testing that traditional laboratories will do. And it's something that most laboratories won't do. And I think that's starting to become an issue in court as to whether or not they were permitted to do that sort of testing in his case. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. It's a biggie.
Well, actually, the whole case kind of is
It
going to
hinges
stem from
on
this.
it.
Yeah, this whole
Yeah.
case is going to hinge on it. So that's going to be the wild part of this whole thing. And that's why I always said that he would never confess to anything, nor would he take a plea. Just take it out and see what happens, because there's a chance. New York State's very liberal. I mean, if you didn't know it, I mean, this is a prime example out of this. And the question is, could you explain what the Fried hearing is for everybody, like in a kind of quick thing, like how it works with the forensic science?
So very basically, a Fry hearing is one that is going to give you permission to admit evidence in a case. Let's say in this case, DNA testing. It's going to say that this is something that's approved or been approved by the scientific community. In other words, I can't come up with my own type of DNA testing in my own laboratory without it being peer reviewed and say, well, I'm going to use it in this criminal case and I'm going to rely on the results and present it in court. So it's basically saying that the techniques that are being used have been scientifically accepted and that it's okay.
Gotcha. That's pretty succinct, and we know why you're a lecturer and you have all this stuff, because talk about put the button right on it. So if you're just joining us now, because we just took a quick bump of over 100 and something people watching us right now, we have Lisa Desire, former forensic scientist from the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner. She is just talking about the investigative genetic genealogy, and she's breaking this down. So if you missed some of the beginning, later on, go back and check it out. You mentioned STR analysis. Can you explain to us, and talk to me like I'm 5, because I have no idea what STR is. I hear it used a lot, but can you just tell us, because I'm sure that a couple of us in the room are actually interested in what this STR is all about.
Sure, and it's something that you'll hear often if you're following a criminal case. So STR stands for short tandem repeat. And it's basically the type of DNA testing that forensic laboratories are using to distinguish from one person to the next. So the DNA testing that we're doing is in the nucleus of our DNA. If you remember back to, I don't know, middle school biology, the nucleus of your DNA is sort of the brains of your DNA, the brains of your cell. I mean, it's what controls your cell. So the DNA in the nucleus is DNA that we've inherited from biological mom and biological dad. So half is from mom and half is from dad. And these STRs, or these short tandem repeats, are found in certain locations along the DNA that forensic scientists are interested in. So if you hear terms like locus, allele, and STR, it's basically, a locus is a fancy name for a location along the DNA that a forensic scientist is looking at. An allele is simply a variation of the DNA at each particular location or locus. And the variations that we're looking at are in the number of repeated segments. So our DNA is made of chemicals that we abbreviate A, T, C, and G. So let's say, for argument's sake, one location of our DNA, the sequence A, T, C, and G, might be repeated in one person 4 times. So they'll have a 4 allele. In another person, it might be repeated 10 times. So they'll have a 10 allele. So STR is basically looking at short segments of DNA that are repeated in a head to tail arrangement, kind of like boxcars on a train. So that's what STR stands for. So even though more than 99% of our DNA is the same from person to person, so whether you're related or not, right? Like you and I share more than 99% of our DNA because we're humans. Within that less than 1% of DNA, we have variation of segments. And so that's what forensic scientists are looking at. You know, it's believed that no 2 individuals, with the exception of identical twins, have the same number of tandem repeats in all of the locations that we look at in our DNA profile.
So when you're dealing with this, I mean, how many pairs do they have? Is there pairs numbers that they have to use in certain things, or how many do they need to get in order to get a match?
So there are 20 or 24 locations along the DNA that forensic laboratories looked at. And it's the same 20 to 24 locations. So that way we're able to compare results from one sample to the next, one laboratory to the next. So a lab's going to look at 20 to 24 areas. And in each of those areas, you're going to have short tandem repeats. You're going to have 2 of them in each area. So because one comes from mom and one comes from dad. So you think about it, the more areas along the DNA that you look at, the more discriminatory your DNA profile is going to become. So when I started doing STR testing a long time ago, when STR first came on the scene, in our lab, we were looking at 4 areas. 4. A lot of people have the same information at 4 areas. So then they expanded it to 13 different areas along the DNA. And as the years go on, they started adding more and more regions to look at. So now we're up to 20 to 24 different areas, and there's a lot of variation. So you're able to make that, you're able to distinguish between one person to the next. And the statistics are, you know, something like 1 in greater than 1 trillion individuals, or, you know, something even larger than that. Some of these numbers are like sextillion, non-decillion, something like that. So yeah, so that's why we're looking at, you have to look at least 20 different areas along the DNA.
And I just, so you have been, you're an expert in the court. You've already been certified in court to talk about this in some of the cases that you had to work on. Can you explain to us, because a lot of people don't understand why they can't say it's the guy, it's him? You know, they have to talk in like it's 1 in 16 trillion people, whatever. Why do they have to do that? Because that's a question that we get asked a lot.
Well, the reason they throw out these large numbers is because we need to show how common or how rare a DNA profile is. It's part of the reason why they no longer do ABO blood typing, right? Because at least 1/3 of our American population has O positive blood. Roughly another 1/3 has A positive blood. So your stats there would be 1 in 3 individuals, right? So the reason we throw out these numbers is because we need to show the jury, is this DNA profile that we found, is it common or is it rare? So that's what the numbers are for. As being a little reluctant to say in a report that it's a match or it is him is because of the thought that we haven't done DNA testing on every single person in the world in order to be able to rule them out.
Gotcha. Perfect. That was this. Yeah, because I mean, even in the Rex case, the Herman case, where the DA was talking about putting out some huge number and then to the 10th power. I mean, when you think about those kind of things, boy, I mean, the number's just so huge, and people say, well, why don't they just say it's him, and
Right.
that's pretty much, you summed it up pretty quickly. There's a question here from Matt again. It says, can you explain the reasons and benefits of using YSTR testing? Is that something you can talk about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the STR testing that we just talked about, as I said, that comes from biological mom and biological dad. There's a similar type of testing that's done on the Y chromosome that biological males only will have. So YSTR testing looks strictly at the Y chromosome, and that's beneficial for things like ancestry, tracing a paternal lineage. The reason for that is because unlike your traditional STR testing, that's mom and dad, since YSTRs only come from dad, it's going to remain unchanged. So all males in the same paternal lineage are going to have the same exact YSTR DNA profile. So again, it's good for proving paternity. Joe, I don't know if you have sons, but if you did, your YSTR DNA profile would be the same in all of your sons. And then if they have sons, it's the same in your biological father, any brothers that share the same biological dad with you, and then just go farther up the line. So your grandparents, your great-grandparents, uncles, cousins that are all in that same paternal line. So it's good for proving ancestry and paternal inheritance. It's also good in a situation where we're trying to figure out how many males could have contributed to a crime scene sample. So those are some of the pros of using YSTRs. A con would be that because it's passed unchanged and because all males in the same paternal lineage have that same YSTR profile, there's not a way for you to distinguish between, let's say, your YSTR profile, Joe, and your son's or your father's. So in a case where, I can talk about this is one that I reviewed a few years ago, in a case where there is a sexual assault and the child is accusing her biological father, all the case has is YSTR DNA. Well, biological dad, biological brother, and grandfather all live in the same home. They all have the same YSTR DNA profile. So just looking at that, you're not able to distinguish between the three of them.
Gotcha. That's interesting. So when you have a case, and there's another case I'm thinking of, we won't name it offhand, but there seems to be somebody convicted on a case where there was multiple male donors, and now that's being questioned in certain respects because the Sandra Castilla case, which originally was thought to be a victim of John Bitroff, his name, ends up being Rex Sherman. And now the whole DNA thing has come up again. So I wonder if this has anything to do with the YSTR part of that. I mean, to me, that's really interesting because I never, kind of knew of it in the forensic aspect of that. So to me, that's pretty interesting.
It is. It is. And I feel like no matter what the case, how the case starts, what forensic discipline you're looking at, I feel like somehow DNA works its way into it, right? If you're doing a firearm identification case and you're able to basically reassign back the projectile at the crime scene to a particular firearm, well, what's the next thing you're going to want to figure out? Who was holding that firearm? Who was firing the firearm? The same with anthropology. You're putting together, reconstructing a human skeleton with bones. Okay, now you want to do DNA to figure out whose it is. So it's a pretty powerful tool.
Right. And so Gisela from Grizzly True Crime entered the chat. Good to see you and all the Grizzlies. Welcome. But, this was actually, so Dawn asks, she makes a statement here. She says, fascinating stuff. I'd love to work in this field doing the research to find the familial match. That would be a dream job for me. Not sure if a job exists. Excellent podcast. Thanks, Dawn. So if somebody wanted to get involved with this, even if it was for their own families, whatever, what would you recommend?
So if you're thinking of a career in investigative genetic genealogy, one of the things that I found is very important is that a lot of these people who have jumped into this field are people who have actually started conducting ancestry research on their families for years, just as a hobby, right? Because they want to build out a family tree. They want to know a little bit more about their ancestors. And so way before we were, spitting in a tube and sending it to Ancestry, they were doing what we spoke about before. They're looking through birth certificates and death certificates and marriage certificates and family photo albums and yearbooks and newspapers, and they're trying to piece together what they know to build out their own trees. So that is a very, very big part of this whole genetic genealogy process. So if you're someone who's doing this for a hobby, you've already got half the work done. Then the genetic part comes into taking classes. There are several places that are offering degrees in genetic genealogy now. Ramapo College is in New Jersey. Their students are working on cold cases and they're solving them. I mean, you'll see them in the news all the time. University of New Haven also has I think it's a graduate certificate program in genetic genealogy. But if you don't want to commit to something like that, you can start by taking an online class. There's Salt Lake Institute of Genetic Genealogy. So there's some programs where you can, do them at your own pace from your own home, but I would definitely start looking into that. But remember too, that it's also building those family trees. We were talking a little bit about, what happens when law enforcement, we're starting with CODIS, law enforcement takes that sample to a company, and then the genealogist takes the DNA results and starts building out a tree. Not only are they making the DNA connections between who's related to that sample, whether again it's a crime scene sample or unidentified human remains, but they can't just turn over a list of thousands of people to law enforcement. Some of these trees can grow to be thousands of people, I heard. So what genealogists will also do is, okay, this is maybe this date and time, or these dates and times and places are where this particular crime took place. Well, now look at your list of people that you've generated and start eliminating them. So for example, if it's a sexual assault case and there are females in that family tree, you can eliminate them. You also want to look at maybe the age of the people in the family tree. Maybe they're too young. They weren't even born when these crimes were committed, right? So you can cross them off your list. Maybe these crimes were committed in one area of the country and the other people live in a different area of the country, so you might not want to focus on them. So that's where the experience in building out a family tree really comes into play. There's a lot of brick walls you can encounter. Names are spelled wrong. You're looking at census records. If you've ever looked at old documents, sometimes they're really hard to read. Typos. People change their names. People go by a different name. There's a lot.
People get married.
They get married, right? And then do they change it or do they not change it? Is the name spelled incorrectly? You have a lot of situations where you have non-paternal events, which means maybe whoever you thought was biological dad really isn't biological dad, and you kind of find out the hard way. So there's a lot more to it. So if you're interested in this, I'd say there's a lot of different avenues you can look at, but also if you haven't really want to practice building out those trees.
Gotcha. And we have a question. Have you ever heard, or have there ever been any cold cases where justice has been served purely on the DNA themselves? Do you know of anything? Because usually there's a lot more involved in the DNA, I'm assuming.
There are. Honestly, I couldn't give you the name of one where strictly it was just DNA. There are other things that go into it, and in fact, you will hear attorneys say like, it shouldn't just ride on the DNA itself. But here's the other thing, DNA is a great tool. It's very useful in identifying somebody. It's also useful in eliminating somebody, right? We forget to talk about that. On TV, they're always worried about, or always on the bad guy is, where we forget that we need to talk about whose DNA wasn't left behind. So there's a lot of talk right now in the courtroom that even though you're able to, let's say, conclude that a certain person left the DNA behind, now we're talking about the action piece, right? How did it even get there? If there's DNA found in a sexual assault case, was it really a sexual assault or was it consensual? DNA tests are so sensitive right now that we're getting residual DNA that's left at a place which might not even have anything to do with the crime. So you really need to put it into context before you just say, okay, I have a DNA profile and it matches this person, so they must be guilty. There's a lot more that goes into it.
Got a question from Sheila here. Can you search worldwide or just the country that you're in?
That's a good question. So if you're talking about CODIS, which is the National DNA Database, as I said, the database that forensic laboratories and law enforcement have access to, CODIS is pretty much within our own country, but other countries do have access to CODIS. There's also Interpol, so other countries are able to do searching as well. Now, if you're talking about ancestry or family tree DNA, that's pretty much whoever wants to submit their sample. So you're, with those situations, you're searching within the particular database that you've submitted your sample to initially. But then you can take your raw data from, let's say, Ancestry, and you can upload it to a company like GEDmatch. So GEDmatch doesn't do their own testing, but they're sort of like this central hub, so to speak. In other words, if I send my sample into Ancestry and I want to find out who some of my relatives are and build out my family tree, I'm only going to get the people that I'm related to that have submitted their sample to Ancestry. So if a relative of mine submitted their sample to Family Tree DNA, those two companies aren't going to talk to each other, and I'll never find my cousin in that match unless we both upload our DNA to GEDmatch. So in that case, as far as, it's not so much what country you have access to, but what database you have access to. And they're all a little different.
Gotcha. And Maria Z says, I'm wondering if New York State will win the Fry hearing. So are we, Maria. That's going to be the interesting part there for sure.
For sure.
For sure, yeah. I mean, that's something I think, like I said, that the entire list case hinges on that. So that's pretty interesting. So okay, there's a couple other terms I hope you can define for us or change. What's the difference between, I think it's genotyping and phenotyping? Can you explain that to us?
Sure, good question. So your genotype determines your phenotype. So your phenotype is your physical appearance that is determined by your genotype. So your genes are going to dictate things like what color of hair you have, what color eyes you have, your skin tone, things like face morphology, freckling, are you predisposed to wear glasses, a widow's peak, a cleft in your chin. So your genotype or your underlying genes are what determine your phenotype, which is your physical appearance. And one thing to know is that the CODIS databases, the DNA samples that we're looking at, or I should say the DNA testing that we're doing, that STR testing, the only thing a forensic scientist is able to determine from that is whether or not you were born a male or born a female. So your DNA, your STR DNA profile is a string of numbers and 2 letters, XX if you're born a female, XY if you're born a male. Unlike a public DNA testing company where you're getting information such as hair color, eye color, skin color, and you're getting the physical features from a public testing company, not a CODIS database.
Right. So when I see those drawings that they say this is what potentially that the person looks like, that's the phenotyping?
That's the phenotype, yes. Yep.
What are some of the misconceptions that we deal with investigative genetic genealogy? Like what's the one that sticks in your craw the most? Let's start off with that one because I'm sure there's got to be at least one.
The first one is probably that your information is going to be used in a way that it wasn't intended to be used, which is still a concern. You know, you're sending your sample off and you're hoping that it's going to be treated respectfully and the way the guidelines have been put forth. So a lot of people are concerned about what's going to happen with their sample. A lot of other people are concerned that your health insurance company might get access to your information once you send it off and might deny you from health insurance or might drop you from health insurance. Those are the 2 big things that I have people ask me about.
Well, let's talk a little bit about ethical issues that we're dealing with in regards to the space, right? Because it's still so new. And right
Yes.
now, would you define it as like the wild wild west, so to speak, kind of thing, in
Yeah,
that
and
era?
I think CC Moore has actually said those exact words. She was one of the first people to use genetic genealogy testing in connection with a cold case, and they applied this and realized that the benefits were so great and it could be applied to so many other cases, and it just started to get out of hand at the beginning. Like, there weren't a lot of guidelines put in place, so now there are guidelines put in place, and each agency, or I should say each company, has their terms of privacy that they're supposed to adhere to. So it's in the hopes that when you send your sample in, if you opt out, meaning you don't want law enforcement to have access to your DNA, you're hoping that in fact they'll abide by those rules. Some genetic genealogists have actually admitted to tapping into a database that they knew they weren't supposed to in order to be able to complete their family tree and solve the case. So I think that's one of the biggest concerns. Another one is that, as I said, when law enforcement turns over that sample, they're supposed to, I think even with GEDmatch, they have this separate law enforcement portal to go through. And so it's a concern as to whether or not they're actually doing it, because some companies will not. Some companies will say, no, we're not going to allow you to. And then they have to jump through hoops, and they have to get permission from a judge and a court. And it makes it a little bit more difficult for them. So I know people are concerned about what's going to have their sample. But as genetic genealogists will say also, is that if the public doesn't trust what's going to happen to their DNA, they're not going to continue to send their samples in. And your DNA databases are only as good as the samples that are in it. So it's more and more rules and regulations have come into play. The courts, I believe, are soon going to require a genetic genealogist to be certified to speak to their results. And again, because they turn over a list of potential relatives of a crime scene sample or an unidentified remain, doesn't mean it is that person. You know, there's more investigation that needs to be done before you can come to a conclusion. But it's
Right. I
taken
mean,
off fast.
eventually we're going to see something end up in the Supreme Court too, I'm sure. I mean, when you're looking at some of these cases that, I mean, I look at the two cases right now, either, the case against Rex Sherman or Brian Koberger. I could see these as
Mhm.
potentially ending up in the Supreme Court, because they're going to have to deal with this sooner rather than later in regards, because this thing is just expanding so quickly,
I agree. We'll sit and
so
watch.
well, like I said, we got a front row seat. We can watch the whole world burn down just from sitting right here. But the issue that comes down to is it's a great investigative tool. It's something that could open up the floodgates on these thousands, hundreds of thousands of open cases between missing persons, unidentified human remains, old homicides, old sexual assaults. I mean, you name it.
You're right.
So, I
Right.
mean, it is something that I would love to see used more, but I also I have concerns that like for instance, you brought up the fact that there might be somebody that taps into something they're not supposed to, and the first thing I thought of is that's a great question for a prosecutor to ask before going to trial. Did
Yes.
you do anything? I mean, think about this for a second. The implications on a case where you go to trial and then the defense attorney says, "Did you tap into this?" And they say yes, and now the prosecutor's sitting there going, "Oh, why don't you tell me?" And I tell people, if you don't ask, they're not going to tell you.
Right. Yep. That's exactly right. And, are they going to be forthcoming and give all that information? Of course, if they're testifying in court, that's different. But are they going to willingly admit that they, circumvented the way they were supposed to access a sample? Whether it's from the genealogist point of view or, as I said, law enforcement submitting that sample. So rather than saying, hey, I'm law enforcement, I want to submit this crime scene DNA, they can say, oh, hey, I'm Joe Smith, and I want to find out a little bit more about myself, and enter their sample in as, instead of a crime scene sample, as coming from a person. So that's concerning as well.
So here we have what it says, I'm a genealogy geek because of my great grandma and data geek by professional. Lots of laughs. This is a like a dream. DNA is data. With good analysis, we learn more over time. So interesting.
It really is. It is interesting.
And I mean, when you think about it, it kind of you know, you see what are some of the resources that an individual, let's just say, because now everything is the rave, right? We try to look at cases and we look at the what are some of the, I mean, we know newspapers.com, right, might be one of those kind of things, but what about other open source things that people could use if they were interested in just, you know, experimenting on their own, seeing what they could find, you know, maybe about their own family tree?
One of the things I've found to be really helpful are looking at old census records. So that's very interesting to be able to see who was living in which household at what period of time. And that'll give you information when you're putting together family trees. If you go on, not that I'm plugging Ancestry, but I think Ancestry, they give you the option to build out your family trees without doing a DNA test. So without doing a direct to consumer test. So you have access to things like census records, military records. I think it's called Folds or Fold, something like that. It'll give you access to military records. Find a grave. You can actually see pictures of tombstones in a cemetery. Some yearbook photos will come up, some marriage licenses come up. So they have a lot of different resources there. And social media is huge as well. So you look at someone's Facebook page and all the people that they've tagged or their Instagram page, and it's so easy. You just start going down rabbit holes, you know, because now you're looking at this person in the picture and all the people that they're connected to. And it really will help you start making these connections and giving information. You have to be able to decipher things, as I said, with misspellings of names or name changes. Sometimes they'll use nicknames that don't trickle down and a person might get lost in the shuffle someplace. But once you start poking around, it's really fascinating. You might also find records from Ellis Island, passenger, the passenger manifest list. That's always exciting as well. So
I did that for my family.
You did?
Yeah. I did that for my we haven't been in this country for a real long time, my family. So it was, you had to go to Ellis Island and then you kind of get stuck. I think I got to my second set of great grandparents back out in Sicily. I mean, that's how, and then you have to reach out to them and they're like, yeah, no, don't bother us with this stuff. But yeah, I mean, and you know what the nice thing about Ellis Island was is that they gave you the address that the person gave them when they had it. So you had now an address and you could start doing things on that and dates of birth and everything else that you had going along with it. So it was actually kind of interesting.
And you'll find that on Ancestry too. Then sometimes they'll give you, you know, 5 people with the same name. It's like, which relative is yours, right? So then you're going to go picking through and you don't know because it's so far back. It's the same thing. You're either eliminating people because of where they're living, or a lot of information comes from our family members. Right. So grandparents, great grandparents who like to share stories. Yeah.
Yeah. And I make a recommendation if you're young enough and you have a lot of your relatives alive, including your grandparents or even great grandparents, just ask them now.
Right.
You know, just ask them who these people are. If you're talking about building it, so it could save you a lot of time down the road. They even sell like a book that says, you know, my father's story, my grandmother's story, my great grandmother's story. Just do, if there's something you're interested in, you know, do that, because it can save you a lot of aggravation if you want to try to do this years later, like I did. But you know, when you're young, you don't realize this, so you don't think about that.
Right.
Someone had a question. I missed it, whatever. But is there any confirmation bias or anything that you have to worry about when you're looking at some of these things?
If you're doing it from, let's say, a genetic genealogist's point of view, I mean, a lot of times the less you know at the beginning, the better. You know, it's easy to want to make someone fit into a tree, or it's easy to make someone want to be the person that you initially thought was responsible for, let's say, committing a crime. So I guess, you know, it's something where you need to train yourself to not be biased, to kind of step away and just look at this with a fresh set of eyes. And as we said, sometimes the less you know going into a case, the better. But
Right. So yeah, like I don't want to know kind of thing, and just let me
right,
work on it. Just give me a name, I guess is that what you'd go
right.
with, and then
So
let
if
you
the
run with it from there.
genealogist does turn over a few names, so we mentioned the Golden State Killer case. I think she had that narrowed down. That was Barbara Ray Ventnor. I think she had that narrowed down to Joseph D'Angelo and his brother as two people that could have been close relatives of the crime scene samples that were left behind. And Joseph, I think, had blue eyes, which she was able to determine from his DMV records, and then turned his name over to law enforcement. Well, so law enforcement is going to trail him. They're going to collect DNA samples from him, but now his DNA has to go back to the forensic lab, and they're going to confirm with CODIS. So as we say, just because law enforcement turns over names doesn't mean those people are guilty. That is another misconception. People are afraid that if their name shows up in a tree that they're going to be arrested. So that's not true. You're just an investigative lead. You know, and the same with CODIS. Even if that DNA sample matches the crime scene sample, doesn't necessarily mean that that person is guilty. It's, you know, just a tool, just something that's going to aid your, assist with your investigation.
So as Analia says, my dad won't fill out the book. I got him. Well, you know what? Yeah, you're gonna have to sit down with him over a cup of coffee and ask him the questions and write your answers down yourself. Maybe you get a better response that way.
I don't know if he's not given the information, maybe he needs a glass of wine or something instead of just a
Yeah,
cup of coffee.
loosen them up a bit, right?
Yeah.
So you have actually written a children's book, Goodnight CSI, right? So it's about getting was it Frenchie is the main character?
Frankie.
Frankie, sorry.
Yeah,
Frankie's the
Francesca.
main character.
Uh-huh.
And it's about getting children involved in the forensics early on. So tell us about that project.
It is. So it's inspired by Goodnight Moon, one of my favorite bedtime stories. I don't know that Goodnight CSI is necessarily a bedtime story, but it definitely will introduce students of all ages to the world of forensic science. So I've worked in a preschool for a few years, and I do remember that we used to have books in there like, I want to be a teacher, I want to be a firefighter, I want to be a doctor. So it explained to them the different aspects of each of these professions. So I thought, well, I could do a fun spin on Goodnight Moon and put some information about investigating. I think I call it a mystery. I do say Goodnight Crime Scene, but I was trying to be very delicate of my words. So I talk about things like looking at bones, looking at blood spatter, looking at different fingerprint patterns. So whether or not it is, oh, thank you so much, whoever just said that.
Thank you. Yeah, the view from home. Thank you very much.
I mean, it might be a way to pique the interest of a little kid, but it's also good for older adults, or I should say older students, maybe someone who's going to college for forensic science. You know, it's just like a fun little twist. People are watching these shows on TV, right? They're watching the CSI shows and they're fascinated. And the children will think that it's fun too, until I say to them, oh, well, forensic science is science and a little math. And then right away, half of them will turn off and be like, oh, I don't like science and I don't like math. And I'm like, well, this is the cool science and the cool math. So just a way to sort of pique their interest, maybe more appropriate for elementary school students. I don't know. I don't get weirded out by looking at obviously blood patterns or pictures of skeletons, but I don't know if a little kid would, but it's fun. I had a good friend of mine do the illustration, so it was a great collaboration with her to make this happen. I had talked about it for a while and she was willing to hop on board. So there it is.
Great. And there's the link to it. Thanks, Missy, for pulling up the link for us. There's the link to the book on Amazon if you're interested. And you're part of a website, or is your website, the Prime Suspect, and you do sip and solve. So you do it for not only kids, but you also do it for team building for businesses. Tell us about that.
Yes. So I started a company that I called Prime Suspect a few years ago. And the whole goal of that was to introduce students of all ages to the world of forensic science. So I say students of all ages. I've said that several times because, really you're talking to little kids about one thing and then you're talking to adults about something a lot different. So my initial goal was to take all the knowledge that I have. Working in New York City, you see a lot, right? And it's interesting stuff. And because people are watching things on TV, there's a lot of misconceptions and they want to know more about it. So anyway, starting with Prime Suspect, I used to go into schools and show students like, hey, this is how the testing is really done. A forensic science teacher is fantastic. They didn't have forensic science in schools when I was younger, but what is a teacher doing? They're basically translating what they've read from a forensic science book and teaching their students. So for someone who has that hands-on experience, you're able to fill in the blanks and sort of supplement with your real life knowledge that a book isn't going to teach you. So that's where Prime Suspect came into play. And I used to do summer camps. And the whole time I would have either parents or my friends ask me about things they saw on TV. How is this really done? Is it true? Can that actually happen? And I know that different companies or different venues will put forth activities like paint and sip, or something like that. Now you're sipping and doing yoga and bonsai trees and everything else. So I thought, well, if you can, sip and paint, why can't you sip and solve? So I designed this activity where the first half, you are actually, you meaning the guest, is actually learning, as I say, the same hands-on shit that you're seeing on TV, the same forensic stuff. So I'm showing you how to interpret blood stain patterns. I'm showing you how to test for the presence of blood. I'm showing you how to dust for fingerprints and make comparisons and what kind of patterns are we looking at. So that's like the first half of the activity, and we're sharing stories about things that we've seen in cases. And most of the time, depending on whether it's a boozy version or a non-boozy version, you're enjoying a glass of wine or a craft cocktail, whether it's a distillery or a brew pub or a vineyard. And then you take all of that knowledge from the first part of the activity, and then you break up into teams and you solve a fictitious murder. So you'll come to one station and you'll have to dust something for fingerprints and make comparisons. You'll come to another station and you'll have to test for the presence of blood on something. They're really a lot of fun. So we do them as a sip and solve, and then we do them as a corporate version, which I call CSI, for collaborate, solve, innovate. I have done some summer camps. You know what? I've done summer camps for kids, but I've actually entertained the idea of doing a summer camp for adults, like maybe a nighttime summer camp. That might be fun, right? Why not?
Why not? Hey, listen, we do know that there's a lot of interest in a lot of these things, and I think it's great that you're reaching out to the kids, because that's really where it all starts, right? I mean, I always say law enforcement's having difficult time with recruitment. I'm like, well, why aren't you going into the high schools, and why aren't you going into the, you start to build up the experience in those relationships. Do that now. I mean,
I
that's
agree.
pretty much where it is.
Right.
So, listen, that hour flew by quick. That was great. We'd love to have you on again, because there's so many questions that we weren't able to get to during this time. But wow,
Wonderful.
that was pretty good. I mean, I enjoyed that myself, because this is really a topic that I want to learn more about.
Awesome. It is fascinating. I think every day you find there's another case that's being solved with IGG. So, whoever, I saw a couple of comments for those of you who are interested in it. I wish you a lot of luck. I think you're going to have a lot of work on your hands. So go for it.
Very good. All right, Lisa, you hang out one second. We're going to end the live stream now. Everybody, thank you very much, and enjoy the show. And we'll see you on Tuesday night at 6 p.m. All right, take care, guys. Bye.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.